Well, good morning and welcome to another FS Club webinar. I'm absolutely delighted today that we're talking about a subject which is very deep, deep meaning and deep to my heart, which is global innovation and national interest. And we're delighted to have an extremely special guest, Professor David Bogle, Vice Provost and Professor of Chemical Engineering at UCL. I've had the privilege of knowing David for a number of years, and in particular, he's also deep in the livery movement with the Worshipful Company of Engineers, amongst others. So it really is an honor to have you here. And what we're going to be talking about today is, of course, vital in a world that's moving forward yet again in technology. The two great movers that have brought life forward on the planet over the last couple of generations have been an increase in trade and also an increase in our technological knowledge and prowess. But over the last 40 years or so, this has really changed, and particularly since the end of the Cold War. I was involved in MOD research at that time, and we have seen enormous changes in that. The USA used to be almost 3/4 of global R&D, at least as formally recorded. It's now less than 30%, and many other countries are out there doing many different things. But our Prime Minister wants us to be a technological powerhouse, and we also need to look at that from a national interest point of view here in the UK. Anyway, you know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of XIEN, and it really is a privilege to be able to introduce so many of these webinars, and I can only do so because our sponsors listed here, the many and varied, allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. Well, today we're going to be doing all of that. It's definitely a lot of technology, but the innovation and national interest area really meets on the economics, and of course all of this needs funding. So I hope all of our sponsors will be satisfied with today's topic, but even more importantly, thrilled to have today's speaker. Now the agenda is straightforward, as those of you in FS Club know. Our speaker will have approximately 20 minutes to kind of set out a case in his keynote presentation, and we'll move into questions and answers. So just before we do so, 3 points from me. One, yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will go up in approximately 48 hours, hopefully just before the weekend, so you can share it with friends and colleagues. Secondly, the slides, yes, are available on the website, and Peter, who's behind the scenes here, has actually put them into the chat room as well. And finally, the question and answer format itself. It's a bit radio talk show host, but if you feed the questions into the GoToWebinar Q&A facility, I will introduce them in conversation with David. Your name and email will be attached to all of the questions that you type in, and they will all be sent to David, so he will get everything. So if there are points of detail, he can follow up directly with you. And please do use that facility, because I am here with you. I am not on Signal or WhatsApp or taking emails or any other media. We're very much here for the next 40 minutes or so. So with no further ado, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction, Michael. I think you can hear me? Yes, good. So let's go on to the next slide. So as Michael said, I'm going to talk about global innovation and national interests, and he's given us a very nice set of context for it. Let's go immediately to the next slide, just to explain a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to just give you a little bit more depth on the context and a couple of examples. Then why this, I've got something to say about this, is I've been on an advisory board for a project at the so-called BRG Institute, the Berkeley Research Group Institute in San Francisco, a project funded with quite a wide advisory board, of which I've been one. Many from the US, well connected into influencing the White House over many, many years, and into the Biden administration at the moment. But also here in the UK, there's 3 or 4 of us, someone in France, Germany, Japan, I think we had someone in Korea as well at some stage as well. So it's been going on for a couple of years online, inevitably, of course. So I'm going to talk a bit about the findings of this this project very briefly. And there are, well, I'll come back to that. And then something about the threats to that are confronting us, particularly as liberal democracies. And the real point about this is the need for international science and technology agreements amongst the liberal democracies. That's the basic premise that we put forward. And I've put forward a few questions right at the end. So let's move on to the next slide. So The project just looked at a whole load of issues in the context, and we've put a few of them into this. Just a few, you know, there's been in the last 30, 40 years significant cross-border activity, particularly at the end of the Cold War. Obviously, the rise of the European Union and economic growth in East Asia, and we also have very increasing educational levels and technical capabilities of people throughout the world. But especially, and you'll see, we've especially talked about engineering, design, and fabricate. It's not just about science; it's science and technology and the exploitation of those things. Globalization of multinational corporations, that's MNC there, have, of course, we know they're much more substantial cross-border investment in what they do, but also in the people and the exchange of people well outside the home nation, and we will all be very familiar with that, particularly in science and technology with big pharma, big oil, big chemicals, aerospace, defense, all these sorts of things, a lot of them very much in global activities. And of course, virtual and online collaboration, knowledge exchange is much more and will continue to be the modus operandi. I can tell you in the last couple of years, I've been able to do even more international work than I used to without even moving. And then globalization in general, with the increasing sophistication of the supply chains. So the the supply chains are much more global than they used to be, in this sort of idea of the global industrial commons, and we know that a little bit to our own cost in this country at the moment. So the next slide, just if we have a little look at research and development spending, this is some of the G20, and it turns out the G20 accounts for 92% of global spending on research and development. So, you know, that's really a dominant picture. And you'll be familiar with the UK as 1.7 and aiming for 2.4, European Union aiming for 3, I think 3, and Germany nearly there, France and Italy a bit lower, US 2.79. And then, of course, we have the big giants of South Korea, 4% of GDP on, and Japan still 3. China, really, as we know, coming, and I'll of course come back to China in due course, and some of the lesser cases. So really significant dominance of the G20 in research and development. So let's move on. Next slide. And it was very interesting, and I wasn't aware of this until in the 60s. US R&D investment, public and private, was 70% of the world's total, and now it's less than 30%. Now, that's not saying that the US has reduced, it's just everything else has grown around it. So 20 nations, as I say, spend 2% of GDP on research and development, and that's as we saw in the previous slide, you know, really dominating the research and development spend across the country. China, the European Union, employ 1.5 to 2 million total researchers in public, private, and academic. So it's a you know, huge number of people, and I think the whole nature of people, which is one of the things I've been putting in particularly as part of my core job, is the people is a real output of research, and that's the real driver of innovation in society, very much as much as intellectual property, papers, patents, and data. So collaboration has become ubiquitous. Global knowledge networks are very dense and tightly linked. So I had a couple of examples which I thought I might bring. Next slide. You know, a very famous one to us here in this country, the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID vaccine. Collaboration between the Jenner Institute at Oxford and something called Vaccitech. But they got a lot of financing from, I think, around the world. You see with Google Ventures and obviously Oxford Sciences Innovation, they're more local. But and of course it was supplied, made a huge impact on particularly the developing world. There's 150 million doses at low cost to the developing world. But of course it all started with some basic science, with the Wellcome Trust supporting Professor Gilbert as early as 2007, looking at influenza vaccination. So, you know, seeing right the way through from basic science through to real impact and impact across the world. Then I've got one other example which is closer to home for me. Next slide. Because it comes from some colleagues of mine in the chemical engineering department at UCL. I just thought, well, I had this information, so I thought, and my colleague Dan Brecht set up this company called Bramble Energy some years ago, and it's about a revolutionary new, as it says, revolutionary new platform for making electrochemical reactors. So it's all about mobile electricity, renewable electricity generation using fuel cells at a much smaller and more flexible scale. And if we look at the next slide, let's just takes you through the timeline of their things. I'm not going to go into any details, but they again started with some basic research. EPSRC, if you didn't know, is the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. It's collaboration between UCL and Imperial. And then they won various different types of funding from various different sources, and almost all of their money, as it happens, came from the UK. But I know they've had a lot of interest from other things, and we've got various different sorts of this angel round, and I won't go through all the details, but down the bottom right there, various bits of institutional venture money of one sort or another, and some names that you will probably recognise better than me down there. So they had a range of different funding, and indeed there was just an announcement this week that they got another 40 million of funding from somewhere. And Tom was, when I talk about people, Tom was a PhD student in our department, and he's now the CEO, and a lot of it spun out from his PhD work. So I just thought they were quite interesting to see, taking right the way through from pure research funded by the nation, right the way through to impact, national and global impact, and certainly in this case, well, these two cases. And of course, increasingly money also comes internationally as well. So let's move on to the next slide, and let me tell you a little bit about this project I've been involved in. Global Innovation and the National Interests. As I said, it was the BRG Institute. It's in Berkeley, California. A small team, very small team running it, but a wide advisory board, which I've had the privilege to be on with these very interesting people. And we've been meeting every couple of months for the last couple of years. And it's come out with some findings. So let's move on to the next slide. And some recommendations. So again, science and technology innovation policies in liberal economies. We were particularly talking about the liberal economies, and we had mostly around the G7 and a little bit beyond involved in the conversation. Evidence of cross-border networks means no country goes it alone in science and engineering or innovation, which was the case in the 1960s. You know, the US really could be dominant, absolutely dominant, and now that's not the case. We know about the huge growth, particularly in the European Union, and its very significant research spend and activity. So value capture from extra-national as well as national innovation is critical to really making the most. Now, but we'll come back to that in due course. The growth of these knowledge networks means that we have to have a certain amount of prioritization in our different countries. They call it smart specialization. This is really critical for economic prosperity and national security. You can see that certainly going on in this country, but also the European Union and in the US. It's deciding where it's really going to spend it and really try, not necessarily to reduce the fundamental research, because lots of new things come out, but when we're really going to take things forward into innovation, where is it going? No country goes it alone. And political and economic allies must collaborate through multilateral strategic innovation and research agreements, resembling and sometimes part of international trade, investment and security agreements, of which we already have quite a lot. And I'll come back to that just at the end of the presentation. So a couple of examples here that we identified that really are things that we have to work together on. Future wireless systems, 6G, removing space debris, digital epidemiology. You know, this is a very, we know this to our very strong cost in recent years. Coastal infrastructure, lots of sustainability issues here are we really need to collaborate on these things to make sure that we get the progress we want and the impact that we want, as well as the value capture, the revenue generation, as well as the impact. Next slide. So couple of the findings then, and these were the sort of main findings, but there are, towards the end, after I've finished, there are 3 extra slides which have the findings in more detail, or some of the findings in more detail, but I decided I'd just focus on these three. Liberal democratic governments need to benchmark, invest in, and align on vital interests, vital areas, including research and development, investment, antitrust, intellectual property, immigration, that flow of people, post-secondary education, and retraining to really capture value for our nations, both local, using local and global innovation. So we can't do it alone. We need to collaborate and identify what we want. Universities must update approaches to international academic collaborations. We're mostly funded by national agencies, but we are increasingly expected to really be global players. And certainly I work UCL, undoubtedly one of the great global universities of the world. But still most of our money comes from national. How do we square that, making the global impact and the way we're evaluated and viewed with where the money comes from as well, and making sure that the country sees the value from investing in our universities. And then companies operating in liberal democracies responsible for most national and economic security value capture. So there will need to be new forms of engagement with these companies, governments, and research universities. We engage with a lot of them, of course, but it's quite a complicated space, and we think that there's a need for some similarity, particularly when we cross borders, and particularly with these multinationals, which are cross many. I have worked with many such companies over the years, and it can be complicated. So the next slide, please. So there are threats, of course, and you'll see I've often talked about the liberal democracies, and we've come across often talked about China. China's science and technology policies are often not aligned with openness and national treatment and reciprocity. And I work quite a lot with China, visiting position there, and we work quite well, but we have to work out how to make sure that works appropriately, given they don't have the same set of values and modus operandi as we do. And there's a lot of actions going on here. There's a UK National Security and Investment Act recently came out. The European Commission has a very interesting discussion paper on tackling research and innovation foreign interference. I think I might have a link to it on the last slide. Just recently, the US House of Representatives passed this Competes Act, United States Innovation and Competition Act, addressing US competitiveness in China, and there's various bits of guidance for the White House and the whole way that the US folks, because they are quite probably more conscious than us of the challenges of China as a potential technology powerhouse. So next slide. So we come now to really what we think is really important. Obviously, we've got government and its regulatory policies, universities, and multinational companies. They're all parts of this complicated ecosystem for doing and developing research and technology, but also getting value capture from it. So we would like to see model international agreements to help us support these international problem-oriented research and development collaborations. So let's, next slide, please. So, and that's two parts of the same. This is the, just expanded a little bit on the last things. We need, our argument is very much for the need for these science and technology international agreements and collaborations, much more than the bilateral sorts of things that we have at the moment. So we would like these model international research and development for liberal democracies to really align policy and policy responses to strategic competitors and really promote this collaboration, but also it's important in promoting global security. And then a series of international problem-oriented research and development collaborations, much more broad, in a way that the across the whole of the liberal democratic world, between us, the US, European Union has some activities in this space, but we think there's much more to be done across borders, organizations, and sectors. So the next slide is a map that was done for our project, trying to look at, you know, the rows here: basic research, applied or problem-oriented research and development, and trade. And we're really talking about that sort of middle one, because the top one does have quite a lot of science agreements. So the columns, then we have knowledge and public goods. The more market stuff is the middle, and then the much more security ones on the right-hand column, which I'm not really talking about so much here because they're quite well covered. And the trade things, we can see trade has the World Trade Organization, the General Agreement on Tariff, and it's whatever that is, I've forgotten now. And it's just what in the middle. There are some research and development collaborations in certain specific areas, and obviously in national security areas. But we think this bit in the middle is really where it's mostly unaddressed in this sort of more market end and the applied end, which is where a lot of the value capture really comes in a financial and in some sense sustainability and sense as well. So that's where we're trying to focus, and we've spent just before I go on to that one, Peter, the group and the leadership of the group has been working quite closely with the members of the G7, and there was a paper went up to the G7 conference last year as well, because this is where a lot of the activities I showed you before. So we have connections into the US, UK, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, and whatever the other seventh one is, which I can't remember offhand. And the need to really try and do this much more systematically, aligned not only with we could align these sort of agreements in the way that trade agreements done, but something a little bit more about this applied and problem-oriented research and development, and setting up general agreements that could really facilitate and allow us to really draw the value that most is useful to us in our individual nations. So a few questions on the next slide, which just really to promote some discussion possibly. There's the whole issue of national security, which we I've sort of avoided talking about, but you know, where is the genesis of a lot of national security ideas? A lot of them does come from fundamental research that is often funded at a national level. But that is quite well covered, national security. What other strategic areas should we be protecting? Particular strategic areas at a national level, and ensure those relationships where others want to be involved in certain strategic areas are well managed. Generating value from fundamental research, can we encourage this collaboratively while ensuring benefit for all? I always think collaborating on fundamental research tends to be easier than on more applied level research. The taxpayers, you know, obviously they see the ideas and they know they're putting the money in, but there is a concern that value is being lost. So there is a relationship here between the research and development space and the general public to make sure that they really see the value. I've mentioned about the movement of people, which I think is a big thing, that people are often the way that ideas get translated anyway. So we need to be really thinking about that. What about working with where values are very different, perhaps in China, perhaps in other parts of the world? The European Commission, for example, recognizes that we work with repressive regimes, but there are obviously challenges. I know that Germany worked all through the Soviet era with the Russians in order to maintain, at scientific level, the Helmholtz Association in particular, to try and maintain that relationship. So we have to do that. And are there particular challenges for the UK in this whole area? So with that, next slide, just some acknowledgements. Yes, from Bruce, Guile, and Eon Lisa, the two really running the BRG project. There's a big advisory board. It's on the website, and my colleagues Dan Brett and Paul Shearing, who really set up the Bramble Energy, gave me those slides. Series of papers from the project. The links are all there. And with that, the next 3 slides, which we'll split through, are just the findings of the project. Findings 1, Cold War to today. Findings 2, where we are today, and findings 3, I can't remember what the third one is, much more about what I've been saying already about how we need to focus. So with that, I will say thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to some discussion and some questions.
David, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for a real whip through a very complex and interesting subject, and one where you're really trying to take in the breadth of the world, including the future world. So I'm impressed that you got through it so swiftly. And as I suspected, given our audience out there, which is quite large today, so do get your questions in early if you can. I've already got quite a few questions. First, just a small point of detail. You know, all reports have to be done with the numbers that you have, and if one wants to shoot a report down, one questions the numbers that it was based upon. Hugh Purser points out that on the slide on global R&D spend, does this include defense and military R&D spending? That was kind of one thing. Historically, the figures have been a bit unclear. We also have areas, you know, here in the United Kingdom where we've Gordon Brown, I've often quipped, created more R&D than anybody because he created the R&D tax credit, and suddenly things that firms were doing, which they were normally doing, suddenly became R&D because they got tax credits back. But how comfortable overall were you with the data that you had to rely upon?
I believe that those numbers include defense spend, but I must say I would have to look back. And of course, the numbers that I got were from the OECD. And I suspect the way that people collect their data is, of course, different between different countries. But I think it's a pretty accurate reflection of those are quite well accepted, those percentages that I put up on that slide. I think that's all I can say.
Okay. What I really liked on what BRG is doing is you're not shying away from some tough questions, the relationship with trade, but the concept of allies. So Bill Williams is asking, how can we be sure who our allies are? And Con Keating is curious, how substantial is the effect of international and industrial espionage?
So how can we be sure about
who our allies are?
Our allies. I mean, I remember my late wife telling me that, you know, that your friends, you know, a handshake is never good enough. You need to get it on paper. And that's part of what this is all about, to say, you know, our allies, that's a big geopolitical question beyond my pay grade, as it were. But I think, you know, if we can get these agreements, even with our close allies, you know, one of our close allies is the European Union, and we're having some challenges with them. The more we can get these agreements formalized and put on paper, we know where we stand with what allies there might be. So the follow-on, in a sense, is that collection is who is not, and again, I still think we would still need some sort of trade or some sort of R&D agreement with China at the moment. You know, China is there's a lot of interactions between certainly this country and the US with China, but it's all, you know, people are starting now to think, oh dear, are we getting too involved, and how do we do it? And then that links to the industrial espionage. I think I'm sure it exists. I'm not sure. There's quite a lot of we have lots of mobility in the research and development space in general, in a sort of so that's a sort of, I wouldn't call that espionage, but it is obviously transfer of knowledge in some way, and indeed certainly within universities that's what we think our role is the utilization and transfer of knowledge within companies, within true industrial espionage. Well, I'm going to stick my neck out a bit here and say I'm not sure that so much of it really does go on, partly because the multinationals work across so many different areas, and they know, for example, safety is something that needs to be much more consistent across their operations across the world. You know, the 70s and 80s saw some big disasters where they were, well, Bhopal was one of them, where the safety conditions they were using in India were not the same as they were using in the operations of the rest of the world. So a lot of companies have realized that and are now trying, the ones that are really operating will try and be consistent. Now, when it comes to great new ideas, well, I'm sure it exists, but I think the industrial espionage is much more in the national security end than it is in the sort of industrial end of the world.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I must say my experience has been that a lot of the numbers there are provided by people in whose interest it is to have a large number to justify a budget. I mean, it does exist, but I've certainly found working with large manufacturing firms that they're not complacent, but they're conscious it's controllable. Anyway, moving on that theme a little bit, but we got some bigger ones ahead. So if we could be a little quick on this one, but Douglas Andrews does quite a bit of work in healthcare in China, and he's kind of curious: is a complete decoupling of R&D activities between the USA, EU, and China desirable or possible? If it happened, what means would be available to manage such collaborations anyway? And Phil Williams adds a sort of a pointed point, you know, do we need to work with repressive regimes? So just a little plea there on what you think about the future. Is it good to have this decoupling, bad, or is it just we have to live with it?
I think we need to, because it's part of diplomacy. I've talked about value capture today, but science is, I think, science diplomacy, working together with other nations, keeps those lines of communication open. I mentioned the fact that all through the Soviet era, Germany worked quite closely scientifically with the Soviet Union, largely for that reason. It was not so much about science as about science diplomacy, using it. And I just think the world is so much more global. We have so much travel, Chinese coming and going, the Japanese, the Middle East, you know, there will always be a lot of movement of people, and I do think that a lot of the movement of ideas is I think, more through people than it is through patents, to be honest. So, you know, it's going to happen anyway, and I think we need to be managing that process and seeing it as part of the way that we are able to put our influence in the world to say, actually, this is the way we do things, and we think this is a good way of doing things.
Michael Friel reminds us that the ISS, the International Space Station, is a good example of collaboration through a number of crises. So thank you for that, Michael. I'd like to move to a point Simon Dennis has here. He says, it's all very interesting. Simon works with SAS, the statistical software firm. I think it's the largest privately owned firm in the world, but I may be wrong. Anyway, SAS is a company spun out of a university in 1976. How do we secure the taxpayers' interest when VCs move in to grab the lion's share of returns with large but late investment, and worse yet, being potentially aided by politicians? I think this is also a point that Mariana Mazzucata raises in her book, the Entrepreneurial State, a sort of presumption that this is public stuff that's being privately appropriated. Do you have any views on that?
Well, I think, you know, part of the public, you know, it's taxpayers' money goes in to invest in innovation for the benefit, because actually the way that we draw back the benefit is through the tax system. You know, and we have to make sure that those things are well regulated to ensure that it does feed back into our system and back into the tax system, which then can be reinvested in innovation. Where I think the issue, and of course this is what this is all about, is when those ideas are exploited somewhere else, and therefore we as our taxpayers don't get benefit for it. Well, of course that's going to happen, but you know, we need to have an ecosystem that enables us to really benefit where it's aligned to our what was the word I used, smart specializations. You know, we want to really be, we don't want to be only investing in the area, but we certainly want to be clear where we really want to, where we do really want to be specialized, and make sure that we can really invest in that innovation, invest in the exploitation of that innovation, or facilitate it, let's say, and to make sure that our systems and our regulatory system really enable that and don't get in the way. And that it really is a role for government. So that's the way I would see it. That, you know, if we're clear where we want to draw value and benefit, and we make sure that we can do that so that the ideas really do benefit us, then they will come back through the tax system. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people here will have, you know, there are concerns about the tax system, is it operating effectively and so on, but that again is a political question.
Yeah, there are a lot. I'm going to try and wrap up quite a few questions here, but just to give you a flavor of the interest, and then I think I can structure this. Douglas, Hugh Purser again on much of the value add as a financial measurement emanating from R&D comes from innovation in the hands of the private sector, which is sort of the point we're touching on. How do we bridge that? Charles Henderson, in your question slide, you mentioned taxpayers, but where do beneficial owners, shareholders of global innovation companies come in? You know, he gives an example of the IP group. Simon Dennis again on the transfer of knowledge may be okay, but what happens when the know-how becomes the domain of overseas researchers, etc. So there's quite a bit going on here. I think what I'd like to summarize is that there are a number of theories of how innovation starts, and they all seem to look at the origin as quite different. In 1995, Terence Keeley wrote The Economic Laws of Scientific Research, with a big assertion that it was really the private sector that did it, and that government spending on R&D displaced private sector R&D as a multiple. We have Mariana Mazzucato's others claiming it's all the public sector, and that the open source movement would say, don't worry about any of this, people can collaborate and cooperate, and look at what we've done in terms of building the internet, the Linux base, etc. We've got the moonshot crowd. You and I were speaking in the green room about ARIA and DARPA. And then we've got, I think, a very interesting thesis from Bill Janeway, which is that it's all about war and bubbles, and that innovation is inherently wasteful. It has to be. You have to pursue paths you don't know. So it's suboptimal, leading to the question of, can you have too much innovation, which I think is too infrequently looked at. So private sector, public sector, open source, moonshots, war and bubbles, and I'll quit there. There are probably many others. But in the midst of all that, I would argue that you seem to be starting, I'm sure you're cognizant of all these, but you do seem to have a bias that it starts off as sort of publicly owned institutions with blue sky and that it moves forward. Did you look at some of these other models in detail?
That probably is true of a personal bias, but that, remember where I come from, I've worked not all of my career, but most of it in a university, which is, you know, most of our money comes from the public sector, and I see the ideas. What we are able to do is really think in a really blue skies way, which is very difficult in the private sector. And I have worked in the private sector as well. It happens, but it's very rare, and it's often when it does become really blue skies, it gets switched off because they say, oh, it's not generating value fast enough. And I've certainly seen a lot of that. So I think a personal bias would be that it's not only from that, it comes from lots of, I don't buy into this idea that, you know, the public sector, you know, more public sector money displaces private sector money. I really don't recognize that. And I have worked with industry throughout. As an engineer for my entire career. It's quite hard work getting them thinking about anything that's in any sense long term. So, but I do think all of these things, what the whole point behind this is, it is all these players need to come together and make sure that that we do really have these international agreements that allow us to work as in the private sector, in the public sector, without dampening innovation, but has a structure, better structure, that allows us to exploit the value from these ideas to get value for our taxpayers and indeed our shareholders. I take that point. I haven't mentioned the shareholders, but of course they're a very important part of the equation. But in the end, you know, they have a little bit more control over what happens than the taxpayer does, who only gets the once in every 5 years vote that they can do. So that's the whole point about this, is these are all actors in these things, but we do need agreements to facilitate and to make sure that we can really get that value capture appropriately for our countries. I think the final point you made about maybe there could be too much innovation is an interesting one. Certainly, you know, we know 1 in 20 ideas are going to go nowhere, even of fundamental, even of relatively applied work. Could there be too much? In the end, that is a question of how much, that's a political question of how much the country and our political masses are willing to invest in it. And we saw from that slide early on in the Far East, you know, they really are wanting to put in. The jury is out as to how effective that is as an investment.
Okay. Time for just a couple more points. Perhaps a quick one. I'm afraid I'm going to raise the B word, but the Integrated Defence Review states that the UK will embrace innovation in science and technology to boost national prosperity and strategic advantage. Douglas Andrews again, you know, what impact, if any, has Brexit had on the UK's ability to collaborate with EU on R&D initiatives?
Quite significant. And of course, there's still a dogfight going on about our ability to engage in the major public funded programs, the Horizon program as it's called, and that's still not clear. Certainly what we are seeing is a significant reduction in collaborations. We're trying very hard to maintain them, and the people flow, that's been the biggest challenge for the public and private R&D world. Actually, I know, speaking to them, you know, lots of recruitment from the European Union. It was so much easier before, and now it's really very difficult. Just struggling with an ATAS certificate at the moment, although it's not from Europe. So it really has reduced things, but we're working hard to try and maintain it. I think that's true in the company space, multinational space as well.
Just touching on that, Nick Dutt says the large multinationals often centralize R&D in their home country, with foreign units primarily used as sales channels, really. And this creates difficulties for small companies in other countries to develop. You know, that's one policy. Michael Friel reminds us of a lot of the little stuff in sort of trade obstacles and frictions. Hamburg City historically retains a share in Bayersdorf and protects it as an asset, making it difficult to take over. You know, is BRG looking at reducing some of those trade frictions?
Well, at the moment, it's just a relatively small project. It's really trying to push this big idea to the G7 about getting a more structured set of agreements. And it was only a 2-year funded project, interestingly funded by David Sainsbury, actually. So you know, we were looking at what these trends are, trying to get some of the information around. We were not looking at that level of detail. It's much bigger, broader scope of things. There was an interesting point you just brought up at the beginning there. I was going to make a comment on. I forgot what it was now. Anyway. Okay.
Well, actually, we're to time. I just wanted to end on one just sort of final comment from me, if you wouldn't mind. I mean, I've been seeing this for ages. I did a review of Defense Labs in the United Kingdom in '95. At the same time, Robert Galvin, who was the chairman of Motorola, did a review of the US energy laboratory system, et cetera. And this keeps swinging back and forth. What I really admired about your work at BRG was, you know, really tackling that bit and pointing out the unique element of defense, the need to cooperate, and that sweet spot in the middle, which you highlighted in yellow, where we really do need to do some work on international collaboration. But this is from Barry Brooks, really. Yeah, this is all challenging stuff, but it's about the long term. Who do you think should or could take on resolving better ways of working? Politicians are almost by definition parochial and short term. Who's to lead for the long term?
Well, it's the science ministries, isn't it? It's you know, the politicians need to be behind it, but in the end, it will be the senior civil servants in the science ministries around the world who will be able to put these things together. That's the way I would see it. And the science, let's say the science establishment, you know, the head of the major research councils, but it really needs to bring in these across the world, but it really needs to bring in this multinational and to some extent the smaller industry fora as well, to really be bringing those in as well. Sometimes there's a bit of a barrier between the public and private sectors, which is not helpful.
David, thank you. I mean, I take away from this that it's really in the nature of science itself. It's a bit like the formation of the Royal Society out of Gresham College in 1660. It was very open. It was open to foreigners, of all stripes and colors, but it kept an eye on the national interest. It didn't let the national interest predominate. But it's crucial, and I think that's the same thing here. That's kind of what the Galvin Review came up with. That's it. To actually do science properly, we need to collaborate globally, but we just need to keep an eye on our own back and not let that become a paranoia. And I think this is a really good and important message at a crucial time, so thank you. If I may, I'd just like to give 2 other rounds of thanks. Firstly, to our sponsors. As I say, I believe today fulfills the technology, economics, and finance issues. Secondly, to you, the audience, you've been very vibrant today, and yes, all of your questions and comments will be passed on to David with your email if he wishes to follow up. And a reminder to audience that we've got quite a bit coming ahead next week, even with 3 webinars, and then a fascinating webinar I'm looking forward to on the 1st on the discount processes of the problem, which is definitely going to be talking about the long term here. So lots ahead. But David, it really must be you who is the star today, and thank you so much for putting so much effort in, devoting your time to getting this important message out there and to sharing it with us. We really, really appreciate it. Unfortunately, nobody has invented any decent applause technology, so we have to do it the old primitive way. But if you could multiply that by tens, you'll get an idea of the thoroughness of the applause and appreciation for your work today. Thank you.
Thanks very much.